started with a bark, not from a dog, but from a human girl. When the neighbors of the Morrison family first heard strange noises coming from the old farmhouse on the hill, they thought nothing of it. Maybe the wind, maybe a stray animal. But as days turned to weeks, the sounds grew stranger. Growls, scratching, even whimpers that didn't sound quite a human. Years later, when the truth finally came out, the small Tennessee town would never be the same. Because what they found in that basement wasn't an animal at all. It was a girl. A girl who had been treated as a pet by her own family. It began on a Sunday morning, beneath a sky the color of old parchment. The Morrison farmhouse stood quietly at the edge of the Tennessee Valley, where fields met forest and the dirt road ended in silence. The house, built by Thomas Morrison's grandfather, had seen better years. Paint peeled from its white boards, the porch sagged like a tired smile, and the windows stared blankly toward the world beyond. Inside, the day began as all others did, with the sound of prayer. Thomas Morrison was a man who believed that the Lord saw everything and punished accordingly. His wife, Eleanor, followed his faith with unquestioning devotion. They raised their children in the same way their fathers had, with discipline, scripture, and silence. Their 3 children, Samuel, Ruth, and the youngest, Clara, grew up beneath the weight of that silence. Clara was born on a warm evening in 1879, when the magnolia trees were in bloom. From the moment she arrived, Eleanor said there was something different about her. Something quiet, as she called it, though the word felt wrong. The baby didn't cry much. She watched instead, her gray, blue eyes wide and distant. She seemed to notice things others didn't. The flutter of curtains, the hum of bees at the window, the rhythm of footsteps on old wood floors. "Strange little thing," Thomas once said, holding her in his calloused hands. "She don't even look at me right." As Clara grew, that quiet only deepened. While other children laughed and played, she sat in the yard tracing shapes in the dirt, talking softly to herself. Words slipped from her lips, half-formed, half-forgotten. She loved animals, followed the family dog Jeb everywhere, mimicking his movements, his bark, his tilt of the head. At first, the family found it harmless, even sweet. "She's just imaginative," Samuel would say, laughing as his little sister crawled beside the dog on hands and knees. But Eleanor didn't laugh. She watched the girl with tightening lips and furrowed brow. In church, she whispered to her husband about evil spirits and unnatural habits. And when the preacher spoke about children touched by sin, she clutched her Bible tighter. It began with small corrections. "Clara, sit up straight. Clara, speak when spoken to. Clara, don't crawl on the floor like that." The girl tried. She really did. But her tongue stumbled on words, her body didn't move the way others did. When she tried to speak, her sentences came out broken, her voice too soft or too strange. One evening at dinner, Thomas asked her a question. Something simple. "Did you thank your mother for the meal?" Clara looked up, eyes wide, unsure what to say. She smiled, but didn't speak. Thomas's hand slammed the table. "Answer me, girl." Her small body flinched. The spoon clattered from her hand. And when the words still didn't come, he dragged her by the arm and sent her to her room. "She must learn," he said. Eleanor nodded in quiet agreement. She must learn. From that night on, the room upstairs, small, cold, and windowless, became Clara's world. At first, she cried. Every night, her small voice echoed down the hallway. "Ma, Pa, please let me out," but no one came. Samuel, then 14, tried once to sneak up and comfort her. But his father caught him. "You'll not coddle her," Thomas warned. "The Lord is testing her. She'll break her sin through silence." So Samuel stopped, and silence became the rule. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months. Clara's cries grew quieter. Her words, the few she knew, began to vanish. She stopped trying to speak at all. Instead, she hummed. She mimicked the creak of floorboards, the chirp of crickets, the bark of Jeb outside her door. When Eleanor brought her food, she no longer looked up. She ate quickly, like a frightened animal, and retreated to the corner. "She's losing her mind," Ruth whispered once. "No," Eleanor replied coldly, "she's losing her sin." In the summer of 1887, Tennessee was hit by a heat wave that turned the valley into dust. The Morrison family's crops failed, money ran thin, and tempers grew short. The house, once full of hymns, became a place of anger and prayer. It was around this time that Thomas decided Clara would no longer stay in her room. "She disturbs the others," he told Eleanor. "Her noises, her scratching, I can't rest." Eleanor nodded solemnly. "Then we'll move her below." And so they did. The cellar, dark, damp, and cold, became Clara's new home. They placed a thin mattress in one corner, a tin bowl for food and water, and nothing else. "She'll have quiet now," Eleanor said. Thomas simply locked the door. From that night onward, Clara ceased to exist for the outside world. Down in the cellar, time lost meaning. Days and nights blended together in a gray, endless hum. The only light came from a thin crack under the door, through which faint voices and footsteps drifted like ghosts. Clara learned to listen. To survive, she listened to the creak of stairs. That meant food was coming. She listened to the rain. It meant she could drink the drops that leaked through the cracks. And she listened to her own breathing, the only proof that she was still there. Without words, she made sounds. She mimicked everything she heard. The dogs barking outside, the cows in the field, even the thunder that rolled over the hills. Her mind, starved of language, clung to rhythm and tone, and slowly she began to forget she was human. When Ruth and Samuel played in the yard, they sometimes called out to her through the cellar window, a tiny, barred opening near the ground. "Clara, are you there?" Samuel whispered one afternoon. A sound came back, a faint whine like a puppy's. Ruth giggled. "She sounds like Jeb. Maybe she thinks she's a dog," Samuel joked, though the words tasted bitter. They threw down crumbs of bread, bits of meat. She ate them without question, her small hands trembling. To them, it was a game, cruel, but born from ignorance, not malice. They didn't understand that for Clara it wasn't play, it was survival. When Ruth found an old piece of rope, she tied it around her wrist and laughed. "Look, Sammy, she's our dog." Now, Samuel didn't laugh. Not that time. He turned away, his throat burning. That night, he dreamt of her, eyes glowing in the dark, mouth open in a silent cry. Years passed, but the cellar door never opened for long. Thomas grew more devout, Eleanor more distant, and Ruth soon left to live with relatives in another town. Samuel stayed, though his heart was never truly there. He could hear Clara at night, the faint scratching, the soft whining, the shuffle of bare feet on stone. Sometimes she barked, low, confused, almost desperate. He'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, guilt gnawing at his chest. He thought about her when he plowed the fields, when he prayed, when he ate his meals. He thought about the way she used to hum as a child, those small, tuneless songs that filled the house with warmth. And now, she was nothing more than a ghost beneath his feet. One night, when the moon hung full and pale over the valley, he couldn't bear it any longer. Samuel crept from his bed, silent as a thief. He lit a single lantern and made his way down the hall, the old floorboards groaning under his weight. He reached the cellar door. The lock was rusted, the wood warped with age. His hands shook as he turned the key. The door creaked open. The air that rushed out was thick, stale, heavy with the smell of damp earth and neglect. He raised the lantern and froze. In the corner, something moved. At first, he thought it was an animal, the shape too small, too twisted to be human. Then the light caught her face. Pale, thin, eyes wide and unblinking. Clara, his little sister. She crawled toward the light, squinting, one hand shielding her face. Her lips moved, but no words came. Only a low sound, half growl, half whimper. Samuel's throat closed. He dropped to his knees. "Clara, it's me. It's Sam." She tilted her head. The sound stopped. Then she made a noise, soft, uncertain. "Sam." It was the faintest whisper, the sound of memory clawing its way back from darkness. He reached out, and she flinched, backing into the corner. Her fingers dug into the dirt. Her body shook. He realized then how deep the damage ran. This wasn't just isolation, it was transformation. The sound of the door had woken Eleanor. Within minutes, her shadow filled the doorway, her face hard as stone. "What have you done?" she hissed. "I couldn't leave her there," Samuel whispered. "She's dying down here." "She's gone, Samuel," Eleanor said coldly. "That thing down there, that's not your sister anymore." The devil's taken her. Samuel's jaw trembled. She's not possessed. She's suffering. Eleanor's voice rose like thunder. Do not question God's will. Her shout woke Thomas, who stormed down with his shotgun in hand. When he saw the door open, the lantern light flickering over Clara's thin form, his stress turned crimson. He struck Samuel across the face so hard the boy fell. You shame this house, Thomas said. You shame the Lord. Then, turning to Eleanor, he spat, shield the door. She's never to be seen again, and she obeyed. Samuel was sent away the next morning, forced to work for a distant uncle. He left the farm behind, the sound of hammer and nails echoing in his ears as they sealed the cellar door shut. The Morrison farm aged. Years crawled by, seasons passed. The house creaked with emptiness. Thomas grew frail, Eleanor bitter. No one mentioned Clara anymore. It was as if she had never existed. But the cellar still lived. Sometimes, in the dead of night, faint noises would drift through the floorboards. The scuffle of hands and knees, the soft thump of movement. Eleanor prayed louder on those nights. Thomas drank. The past was buried beneath their feet, but it refused to stay quiet. By the time the century neared its turn, Clara Morrison was 22 years old. In the cellar, she no longer spoke, only breathed, moved, and waited. Her hair had grown down to her waist, tangled like vines. Her skin was pale from darkness, her nails cracked and dirty. She had long forgotten her family's faces, their names, even her own. When she dreamed as an animal might, of light, warmth, sound. Her voice, once delicate and human, had become something else, low, guttural, instinctive. The world above her continued, births, deaths, marriages, while below, time stood still. She had become the secret the Morrisons could never confess, the sin they buried beneath the floorboards, the girl they called cursed, the girl who forgot her name. The night the storm came, the valley trembled. Wind tore through the trees, rain hammered the tin roof, and lightning slashed the sky open like a wound. It was the summer of 1895, and the Morrison farmhouse, now grey with age and sorrow, stood trembling on its hill. The crops had failed again, Thomas had taken ill, and Eleanor rarely left her chair by the fire. The old house moaned with the weight of secrets that refused to die. The neighbors came the next morning to help. Floodwater had risen past the fence line, filling the cellar with mud and debris. Men with shovels, women with buckets, and children carrying rags came trudging through the soaked field. The Morrison family, frail and desperate, accepted their help with forced gratitude. None of them expected what waited below. When the first man pried open the cellar door, a wave of stench hit him so strong he gagged. He turned to Thomas, asking if perhaps a cow had drowned down there, or some animal had died in the flood. Thomas only muttered, "Leave it," and turned away. But the man was curious. He lifted his lantern and peered down the steps. What he saw made him stumble backward. A pair of eyes glimmered in the dark, low to the ground, glowing like an animal's in the light. Then came the sound, a growl, raw and guttural, followed by a sharp, terrified bark. It echoed through the old boards of the house, silencing everyone above. The rain stopped, the wind seemed to vanish, and only that sound remained. The neighbors screamed. The lantern clattered down the stairs, its flame flickering wildly. Someone shouted, "There's a person down there!" And others rushed forward. But before Thomas could stop them, before Eleanor could whisper her panicked prayers, two men forced the door open and went down. They found her crouched in the farthest corner, trembling, soaked, and covered in filth. Her hair hung in thick ropes around her face. Her eyes darted wildly. She tried to speak, but only managed a hoarse series of yips and moans. The men froze. For a long moment, no one knew what to do. It was Clara Morrison. She was 22 years old and had been living like that for more than a decade. The sheriff came. The preacher came. Within hours, the Morrison farm was surrounded by wagons, horses, and curious townsfolk who had followed the gossip. They stood in the rain whispering. Some called her a monster. Some called her a miracle. None called her by name. Eleanor was taken away by the church women, her hands shaking so badly she couldn't hold her Bible. Thomas, too sick to stand, sat in silence as the sheriff questioned him. He said little. What could he say? The truth was worse than any lie. He muttered about God's punishment, about sickness, about how they'd done what they thought was right. But no amount of faith could erase the horror in the sheriff's eyes. They carried Clara out on a blanket, her body fragile, her bones visible beneath her skin. When the light hit her face, she whimpered and buried it in her arms. She made small, rhythmic noises, like a frightened animal trying to calm itself. The rain washed the dirt from her shoulders, revealing bruises that had faded to pale yellow and gray. The crowd stepped back in silence. No one had ever seen a person so broken yet still alive. The doctor from the next town, a tall man with kind eyes named Dr. Hensley, insisted she be taken to his care. He had read about similar cases, children locked away, people raised in isolation, but never in his own county. He promised to tend to her, to bring her back to health if possible. The sheriff didn't argue. The townspeople were restless. Some whispered that the girl was cursed, others that she was a living warning from God. It was easier to let the doctor take her away quietly. That night, as the wagon carried her down the muddy road, Clara lay motionless under a blanket. Each bump in the road made her flinch. She didn't cry, she didn't speak. She only made a faint sound now and then, a short, breathy bark, followed by silence. The rain followed them the whole way to town. Dr. Hensley's home sat behind the small church, a white house filled with books, herbs, and the faint smell of alcohol and ink. His wife, Margaret, helped him prepare a small room with clean sheets and a basin of warm water. They moved carefully, as if afraid she might shatter. When they laid her on the bed, she curled up immediately, knees to chest, hands pressed to her ears. The sound of voices frightened her. Light hurt her eyes. She refused food unless it was placed on the floor. When Margaret tried to lift her chin and feed her with a spoon, Clara growled softly. "Poor soul," Margaret whispered. "She doesn't know what we are. She's forgotten," Hensley said quietly. "Forgotten everything human." The days turned to weeks. The doctor kept notes in a leather journal. Day 30, patient avoids eye contact, reacts to loud sounds with growls, refuses speech, possible trauma response. Day 80, patient mimics barking from dogs outside, seems soothed by rhythm, possible imprinting during isolation. Day 15, patient shows recognition of her name, responds faintly when called Clara. It was that moment, when she turned her head slightly at the sound of her name, that gave him hope. He began speaking to her softly each day, describing simple things: the sky, the rain, the sound of music from the church bells. Sometimes she would watch his lips move, fascinated. Sometimes she would cover her face and shake. Then one morning Margaret found her standing by the window, barefoot, trembling, but standing upright for the first time. Sunlight touched her face. For a second, she looked almost peaceful. She turned and made a sound that was not quite a word, but not an animal noise either. Margaret smiled through tears. "That's right, dear. You're safe now." But safety could not erase memory. Rumors spread through the county like wildfire. Newspapers wrote of the wild woman of Tennessee, the beast girl found in cellar, the human pet. Reporters arrived by train, hungry for spectacle. They offered money for interviews, photographs, even sketches. The Morrisons became infamous overnight. Thomas died 2 months later before the trial. Eleanor was committed to a sanitarium after her mind began to fray under guilt and humiliation. The townspeople washed their hands of them all, except one. Samuel Morrison returned. He had heard the story in a newspaper hundreds of miles away. The words didn't seem real at first. He read them over and over, each line carving deeper into his heart. A young woman discovered living like an animal in her family's cellar. He packed what little he owned and boarded the first train home. When he reached Dr. Hensley's door, he was no longer the boy who'd been sent away. He was a man hardened by years of work and grief. But the moment he saw his sister again, all that armor cracked. Clara sat on the floor beside the window, her hair clean now but still tangled, her eyes distant. She didn't look up when he entered. The room was filled with the sound of quiet breathing, the ticking of the clock, and the faint hum she made, a sound between singing and sighing. "Clara," he said softly. She didn't react. He took a step closer. "It's me, Sam." The humming stopped. Slowly, she turned her head. Her eyes met his, and for the briefest moment, something flickered inside them. A spark of memory, faint but alive. He knelt beside her, tears spilling before he could stop them. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I should have taken you away. I should have fought harder." Her lips parted, a sound escaped, a low, trembling echo of a bark. But then it shifted, softened, reshaped into something almost human. "Sam," she breathed, her voice rough as sandpaper. "Sam." He froze. The sound of his name, twisted and fragile, hit him like a prayer. He reached for her hand, and this time she didn't pull away. Healing was not quick. It was not even certain. But it began. Each morning Samuel read aloud to her. Stories from the Bible, poems, small pieces of memory he hoped might plant seeds in her mind. He showed her how to hold a spoon again, how to write the letter C. When she couldn't speak, he didn't push. He simply sat beside her, humming the lullabies they once shared as children. Weeks became months. Slowly, the fear in her eyes faded. She began to walk upright more often. She even smiled once, an uneven, fleeting thing, but real. One autumn afternoon, as they sat beneath the trees outside the doctor's house, Samuel handed her a flower. "Do you know what this is?" he asked. She studied it, touching the petals gently. She murmured. He nodded, his throat too tight for words. She looked up at the sky then, wide and endless, and for the first time in years, her eyes held wonder instead of fear. The newspapers lost interest. The world moved on. But Samuel stayed. He rented a small house near the doctor's and worked in the fields, spending every evening with his sister. The townsfolk who once gossiped now nodded to him respectfully, shame written across their faces. There were relapses. Nights when Clara would wake screaming, trapped in memories of darkness. She would crawl beneath the bed, trembling, until Samuel sat beside her and sang softly until she calmed. Sometimes she barked again, the sound tearing from her throat uncontrollably. He never scolded her. He simply held her hand until it passed. "She's not broken," he told Dr. Hensley once. "She's learning to be whole again." The doctor smiled. "You're both healing." Years later, when Samuel built a small home of his own, Clara moved in with him. She never married. She tended a small garden, collected stray dogs, and hummed to them in the evenings. The children in the town would sometimes see her walking along the road, a gentle woman with quiet eyes and a dog trotting faithfully beside her. Few knew her story, fewer dared to ask. But those who did said she spoke little, yet when she did, her voice carried an unearthly calm, as if every word cost her something precious. She would pause often, looking into the distance, as though listening to a world only she could hear. One boy once asked her, "Miss Clara, were you ever scared of the dark?" She smiled faintly and replied, "The dark only hurts when no one comes back for you." When Eleanor died in the sanitarium, Samuel attended the funeral alone. The preacher spoke of forgiveness, of mercy. Afterward, he brought the news to Clara. She listened quietly, her hands resting on her lap. For a long time she said nothing. Then she asked, in her soft, halting voice, "She loved me." Samuel hesitated. "In her way, maybe. But she was wrong." Clara nodded slowly. "Then I forgive, but I don't forget." Those were the clearest words she had ever spoken. Years melted into decades. Samuel grew gray, his back bent from years of work, but his devotion never faded. On warm evenings they sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the fields. Clara often hummed the same tune she had once hummed as a child, her voice cracked but tender. Sometimes she would rest her head on his shoulder and whisper, "Thank you, Sam." And he would answer, "For what?" "For finding me when I was gone." When Clara passed away quietly in her sleep at the age of 42, Samuel buried her on a hill overlooking the valley. He placed no headstone, only a wooden marker carved with her initials, CM, and beneath it, a single word, free. He visited often, bringing wildflowers, speaking softly as if she could still hear. The townsfolk said they sometimes saw him kneeling there long after sunset, his lips moving in silent conversation with the wind. The farmhouse where it all began eventually collapsed, swallowed by weeds and memory. Children grew up hearing stories of the girl who barked. Though the truth faded into myth, some said her spirit still roamed the hills, gentle and kind, watching over lost souls. But those who knew the real story, those who remembered the Morrisons and the storm, spoke of it differently. They said it wasn't a haunting, it was a reminder of what silence can do, a reminder of how fear can twist love into cruelty, and a reminder that even the most broken life can find its way back to light when someone chooses to care. On the last day of his life, Samuel sat on that hill. Watching the sun sink low, he closed his eyes and thought of his sister's voice, the way it had sounded when she first said his name. The memory filled him with peace. He whispered into the wind, "You're free now, Clara." A soft breeze stirred the grass around him, carrying the faintest echo, a small, distant sound that might have been a bark or perhaps laughter. No one knows. But the wind carried it down the valley, past the empty farmhouse, through the silent fields, and into the night. And so ends the story of Clara Morrison, the girl who was forgotten, the woman who learned to live again. Not a beast, not a monster, but a soul who survived when the world turned its back. Her story reminds us that cruelty often hides behind righteousness, that silence can be as deadly as violence, and that love, even when it comes too late, still has the power to heal. Because sometimes, even in the darkest cellar, a spark of humanity endures, waiting, just waiting, for someone to open the door. The Morrison farmhouse still stands today, abandoned, crumbling, yet untouched. Locals say on stormy nights, you can still hear faint scratching from the basement floor. But others say it's not haunting, it's remembrance. A reminder of what silence can do. A reminder that cruelty doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers. And most of all, a reminder of a girl who once forgot her own name and then learned it again. This story isn't just about horror, it's about humanity, about how ignorance and fear can destroy and how love, even too late, can heal. In a world where silence once buried the truth, Clara's story reminds us to speak, to see, and to never treat another soul as less than human.